This lecture covers epic literature and Beowulf, and it's part of the background for our reading of Beowulf in English class. And this lecture also builds off of the Anglo-Saxon literature lecture. So if you haven't watched that, please do so now. Alright, so before we look at Beowulf, let's look at the characteristics of epic literature in general. Right, the epic hero always represents the culture's values, particularly the cultural values of the males within that civilization. Right? Epic is kind of a guidebook for young men in that culture in terms of how they should think and act and what they should say. Also, those values are seen in the characters' deeds and long speeches. Epics often have these very long passages of particularly the main hero just talking. And these long speeches are important because they serve as histories and genealogies. Remember that genealogy is the study of one's ancestors and one's family tree. And we can have a genealogy of an individual. We can also have a genealogy of a tribe or a group. And as you know from watching the Anglo-Saxon literature lecture or completing that lesson, these were pre-literate people, meaning they didn't write things down, and so the only way for them to remember their histories and genealogies was to include them in these longer epics. Some more characteristics of epic literature. They usually begin en media res, and what that means is that it begins in the middle of the plot, usually somewhere near the climax. And Beowulf kind of does this. When Beowulf starts, Grendel has been attacking the Danes for about 12 or 13 years, and the epic begins right when Beowulf shows up to fight Grendel. Some more characteristics of epic literature from throughout the world. Characters are often referred to by these epithets, right? In Anglo-Saxon literature, we call them kennings, and I talk about kennings in that lecture. But in general, we call those terms epithets. And so characters are often referred to by a unique characteristic. Remember, I said I might be called Brook of the Rolled Sleeves, or I might be referred to as a family relation, right? I might be called Brook, son of Doug. And so these are common features of epic literature. And again, when you say, John, son of James, right, that preserves that genealogy within the literature. Epics are always composed in narrative verse, right? Verse is a fancy way of saying poetry. Always, right? And sometimes we talk about Star Wars as an epic, and there are things about Star Wars that are epic, but because Star Wars was not made in narrative verse, Star Wars is not an epic in the traditional sense of the term. Right? Remember that these were pre-literate societies, and so the only way they could remember these very, very long stories was to have them in verse. And as you know, poetry is easier to memorize than just regular prose. Epics are always very long. In fact, Beowulf is a very short epic, right? I mean, the Iliad and the Odyssey are these 300-page books. Beowulf, in most translations, is usually only 150 or so pages. But they're long because they show how the hero or the culture develops over time. And again, these epics are common throughout the world, right? As we look at some other well-known epics, things like the Iliad and the Odyssey from Greek literature, or the Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Babylon, or the Ramayana, which is an Indian epic. Very, very common. All right, so now let's shift our attention to the background for Beowulf, right? And so again, the story opens in media res when the monster Grendel has been attacking the Danes' mead hall known as Heorot, right? I mean, I talked about mead halls in that Anglo-Saxon literature lecture. Heorot is the name of the Danes' mead hall. And we don't know why Grendel has been attacking Heorot, but the poem does say that it's because he's related to the biblical figure Cain, right? Remember, Cain is the first murderer in history according to the Bible. So we don't know why Grendel's doing what he's doing, but because he's related to Cain, he's obviously evil, right? Again, as I mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon lecture, Beowulf has both Christian and pagan elements, and Grendel's relationship to Cain is certainly a Christian element within the story. And the king of the Danes, who's named Hrothgar, has been unable to stop Grendel. And again, Grendel's been attacking Heorot for something like 12 years. And Grendel cannot be hurt by the Danes' weapons. There's something magical or invincible about him, perhaps because of the mark of Cain. In the Bible it says that a mark was put on Cain and that he somehow couldn't be or shouldn't be killed. And so perhaps this is, again, another Christian element within the story. And so in comes Beowulf, and Beowulf is not a Dane. He's a Thane from the Geats, and the Geats were a southern Swedish tribe. And he hears of Hrothgar's misfortune, and so like any good pagan hero, he wants to increase his pride and increase his name. Remember, to the Christians, pride is a very bad thing. However, to the pagans, pride is everything, right? The way for a pagan hero to be immortal and to have everlasting life is to make a name for himself as a soldier and a warrior. And so this young Thane Beowulf sets out to build his pride and conquer this monster. There's also a little bit of tribal pride here too, right? If a Geat can go and save the Danes, it shows that the Danes are a bunch of wusses and that the Geats are the real men. Right? And as I've said before, originally Beowulf was an oral epic, and it was told by the pagan Anglo-Saxons. And so, this notion of pride, this notion of fate, right? Beowulf talks a lot about fate. These are all pagan ideals. But Beowulf itself was written down by Christian monks, likely in England, sometime in the 900s or early 1000s. And so while this is probably a Danish story, it was brought over by the Anglo-Saxons as an oral story and written down by Christian monks. And so this helps to explain why Beowulf has some of these Christian elements and themes in it. Right? Because Beowulf is a great pagan war hero, but he's also self-sacrificing, right? At the end of the story, Beowulf will sacrifice his life to protect his people from this dragon, right? The dragon is a Christian symbol, right? I mean, we talk about dragons in the book of Revelations at the end of the Christian Bible. And so Beowulf sacrifices to save himself, to save his people from this, satanic dragon. And so, he's kind of a Christ-like figure. And I said Grendel is a typical pagan monster, but then there's this whole mark of Cain business. And so this is really a fine example of crossover literature from the period of Christian expansion throughout Europe. And we see the Christian influence on literature throughout the world. A lot of Native American mythology has Christian elements that, many scholars think is a result of Christian Europeans writing down these Indian stories. And so, we can call it crossover literature. Sometimes we just refer to it as contaminated literature. So keep in mind that Beowulf represents a traditional Christian worldview, though, right? It doesn't matter why something is evil. All that matters is that you don't try to understand it, you just try to kill it. Right? I mean, that's at once both a pagan and a Christian ideal, but in Beowulf, because, Grendel has the mark of Cain on him, he's automatically evil. You don't try to understand it, you don't try to make peace with it, you just destroy it. And so that's it. You're now ready to enter the epic. You know the background of Beowulf and the background of epic literature. And so keep this in mind. This is going to help you understand parts of this epic that can at times be very foreign. Enjoy.